Alright guys, so this is actually the end of the cutting test that you're about to watch. This is the end, I already know the results. But I want to warn you that this video is going to be all about edge retention. There's a bunch of testing going on in this video. We did over 2,000 cuts, rope cuts with both of these knives, and we have some pretty interesting results. So if you're not interested in edge retention testing, next week we will not be doing any because this is probably the last edge retention test I will ever do. So if you're interested in edge retention testing, stay tuned. If you're not, we will be back to our regularly scheduled programming, hopefully next video. Alright guys, so first things first, let's talk about sharpening. Both knives, the Spyderco Tenacious in 8cr13mov and the Spyderco Sage 1 in S30v, have been sharpened exactly the same for each of these tests in this video. At any point in this video, everything is identical as far as sharpening. I used a Lansky controlled angle sharpening system and sharpened each knife at 20 degrees, starting with the coarse stone and then moving to the medium and finally the fine, and lastly stropped the same number of times on a green compound strop. Both knives are hair popping sharp and they both cut paper exactly the same. Not really a surprise. Now the rope I'm using is Sisal rope. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm not, I don't really care, as it doesn't really affect the outcome of the test. Just a quick note, this is a different rope than I used for the first testing video. Now, due to the nature of this test, it doesn't really matter. For in this test, we are looking for consistency within this test only. More on why this doesn't really matter in a minute. Next, the cutting surface or the cutting board I'm using is an end grain piece of hickory cut from the same piece of wood. If at any point I make a change of the cutting surface in the video, both knives have the same exact amount of cuts on each surface. Again, more on why this matters in a minute. So the first test I'm performing is a working edge test. The parameters are how long does each knife cut until it will stop cutting effectively. And I will be using regular printer paper to help me make that determination. This is the longest test of the video, and we will be testing each edge to a finer degree later on. The rope I'm using for this test is Sisal rope, and also I put a mark on each blade so I can start the cutting motion in exactly the same place each and every time. I'm using a push/slicing motion in order to get through the rope. And again, I try to remain consistent with each cut. So as we're sitting here looking at the footage, we need to discuss a few things, namely variables. In order for this test to be conclusive, we need to eliminate as many variables as possible. We also need to identify what makes those variables variable. One variable in particular is the rope itself. What exactly makes this particular rope abrasive enough to effectively dull a knife edge? How do we know for certain that each section of rope is exactly the same? I did some research on this and discovered that there has been no study done on why any rope, for that matter, is abrasive and what abrasive qualities this or any other rope possesses. So what exactly does this mean? Well, it means that simply on that fact alone, this test can be ruled inconclusive. But why? Well, because we don't really know if it's a constant test medium, and the only way of knowing is to do multiple tests with the same steel on the rope itself. But in this test, we're not testing edge retention, we will be testing the rope consistency. And again, as far as I know, this particular testing hasn't been done, which is exactly the reason one test can't be compared to another test. So the footage you just saw there was the Spyderco Tenacious in 8cr13mov making 420 cuts on our rope and still slicing paper with relative ease. Next on to the Spyderco Sage 1 in S30v, and we're going to be making the same exact amount of cuts as we did with the Tenacious, and as it should, the S30v still cuts paper practically the same as the Spyderco Tenacious does. So at this point I could not distinguish a noticeable difference, so back to the rope cutting. So we have 568 cuts on each of these knives on Sisal rope. I'm going to continue on with this testing, but we're about to get a storm here, so I want to clean up and go inside, and I'll continue testing tomorrow. I still have a bunch of rope to cut. After over 1,000 cuts, I would say we're neck and neck. There's not a significant difference between the two. There's not a difference that I can tell between the two. I'm going to continue testing tomorrow, and I'm not going to do anything to the blades overnight. They're going to sit right here, and I'm not going to touch them. Alright guys, it's day 2 of our testing, and I think I got enough rope here for another, I don't know, 600, 500 cuts, somewhere around there, we'll see. So I'm just going to continue on with what I have, and we'll just take it as far as we can. I only got a little hang up there, but once you get it started, it still does kind of cut paper. I wouldn't say that it doesn't cut paper. Whoop, little hang up there. But I don't know. Might be seeing a result here. But then you end up getting a cut like that, and it's perfect. And we're still cutting right where we're doing. Hopefully you can see that. We're still cutting right where I have the blade marked. It's a new piece of paper. Let's try this again. Again, that's right where we are doing the cutting. You end up getting a good cut like that. Same for the S30v. Oops, that was a bad one. Oops, gotta hang up. Oops, gotta hang up. You know, you end up getting a cut like that on so are they reliably cutting paper, or are they not reliably cutting paper? That's the question. At this point, we are, and each one of these lines represents 20 cuts, so it should make it relatively easy to figure out how many we did. So we have 428, 528, 628, 728, 748, if I did my math right. 748 cuts on the rope for each knife. So hold on a second, I know what you're probably thinking. The Tenacious looked like it hung up more on the paper cutting test. And maybe it did, but maybe the Sage 1 just started cutting on a slightly sharper part of the blade, because we got hang-ups on the Sage 1 as well. Now this is where we run into a problem. If we are looking at this from a scientific point of view, we have to take some things into consideration. One of those is margin of error. Since we have so many uncontrolled variables, one of them being the human element, maybe I was using slightly more push cutting on one knife or slightly more slicing motion with the other knife. Those are variables. Again, what if the rope is inconsistent? Is our cutting surface consistent? Again, variables. Hence, there has to be a margin of error. Also, at some point during the testing, I have to declare one knife sharper than the other for us to get a conclusive result. Now, over the course of 750 cuts or so, where do I draw that conclusion? At 740 cuts? At 730 cuts? How about 734 or 746 or 751? There's not a definitive point in which one knife stops cutting and the other one doesn't. Again, more margin for error. So how would we fix this? Well, we'd have to do the same exact test over and over and over again in order to get a larger sample. With the more testing we do, the better picture we can form as to what knife actually has better edge retention and what that difference actually is. You see, we'd have to average out multiple tests, and maybe over the course of 10 or more tests, we'd start to form a clear picture of what knife actually has better edge retention or which knife is actually sharper. So, with that being said, let's move on to the other test. Alright, so for this test, we're going to see how many cuts we can make on the rope before the knife stops reliably shaving. Is this another subjective test? Absolutely, but it's all subjective and it's just another data point. Now, if you remember from our last video, we were able to get, I think, 40 cuts, if I remember correctly, 40 cuts before both of these knives stopped shaving reliably. So this is a different rope than I used last time. Here's the rope I used last time. This is the rope I'm using this time. So we'll see if those results remain consistent. We'll start with the tenacious. So for this test, I am making 2 cuts and then checking to see whether or not it would shave. And then 2 cuts and checking again, and so on. It's still shaving, 20. So it still is shaving a little bit at 40 cuts. So maybe this rope isn't as abrasive as this rope. So we'll continue on. I think I'm going to start cutting every 5 cuts, or start testing every 5. Alright, let's stop there and we'll cut the same number of cuts on this knife. We'll see what happens. So we'll just test every 20 because we know we should be beyond that. Alright, we've got 80 cuts on each knife. And they both feel the same to me. Alright, so let's switch ropes here. This is the rope that I originally started cutting on in the last test. It's a different rope. This is a Manila rope versus Sisal. Sisal rope. Let's get a fresh starting piece here. We're just going to continue on with our cutting until they both stop shaving. So we'll continue on with this. Alright, so there's 20 cuts with the other kind of rope, with the Manila rope, and I think we're about at that point. Let's see what 20 cuts will do on the S30v. So there's 20 cuts on that knife, and it's not shaving anymore. So I decided to redo the last test, this time with the Manila rope I used in the last video where I got 40 cuts before both knives stopped shaving. This time I cut 20 cuts with each knife, at which point they both still shaved. No difference between the two. Next I started testing every 5 cuts till I started to see a difference. It is, let's hold it there, 35. So we got 35 on the tenacious. There's 30. So we got 35 on the tenacious. And it's not shaving. So both of them have 35 cuts on them. So somewhere between 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, they stopped shaving. What does that tell us? Well, somewhere between, we're talking about the difference between several cuts here, maybe even one cut, is the difference between each of these knives. It may even be less than one cut, maybe 1.5 cuts, maybe halfway between one cut. So let's recap. During this particular test, both knives stopped shaving between 35 and 40 cuts. Now, I tested every cut between 35 and 40, but they both felt the same. Did the Sage 1 and S30v outlast the Tenacious by 1 or 2 cuts? Maybe, but at some point I have to draw the line. I have to make a definitive decision as to what point a particular knife stops shaving. The cutting is so close here that it really doesn't matter what number I choose. It wouldn't affect the outcome of the test because we still have a margin of error. Again, what that margin of error is, I don't know. All I know is that there is one, and in order to figure it out, we'd have to do multiple tests over a long period of time and average out our results. So how does this affect average everyday use for these two particular knives? Well, it doesn't affect it in the slightest. Both of the knives cut relatively the same, and if there was a difference over a larger sample, the benefits would be practically worthless in real life. So what? Over the course of a year, you have to resharpen the Tenacious 2 or 3 more times. Does it really make that much of a difference? All right, so let's move on to our next test, which is we're going to eliminate all of the variables completely, and we're going to look at one thing in particular, and that is the cutting surface that we're using. We're going to take each knife, bring them back on the strap to where they're shaving sharp, and we're going to drag it across our cutting surface 40 times. And we're going to check the knives just from the cutting surface wear. 100 on each. And it's still shaving. Again, still shaving. All right, so we're not seeing that much edge wear simply dragging it across the cutting surface, but we are seeing a little bit of edge wear because the knives definitely are not shaving how they were before. So a cutting surface certainly does play a role in how fast the edges wear. So where exactly does that leave us with these two knives? Well, I don't think I'm going to do another edge retention test because for me personally, I don't see that you can test this and eliminate enough variables in order to make a sound conclusion for each and every test. I think there's a lot of human element involved in edge retention testing. Unless every single variable can be taken into account, it's going to be really difficult to see the difference between well heat treated cheaper steels and well heat treated more expensive steels. Honestly, for me, I do think that it comes down to the heat treatment more than it does the particular steel. You can get a lot out of a cheap steel if it's heat treated properly and it's within a good working range. A lot of knife manufacturers don't heat treat their cheaper steels hard enough, and I think a lot of manufacturers don't heat treat their more expensive steels hard enough. Do I think that this knife has a bad heat treatment? No, and the reason that I don't think that is because I've done another edge retention test and it was really close to my Endura 4 and ZDP 189. Do both of these knives have bad heat treatments? I don't know. I guess a case could be made for that. Do I think that's the case? No. I just think that Spyderco did a good job with this particular knife. I'm not saying that every single Tenacious is going to be the same as this, but they did a good job with this knife. I think this steel was left pretty hard for 8cr13mov, and that's exactly what the knife manufacturer should be doing. So where does this leave us for edge retention testing? I don't think I'm going to be doing any more edge retention testing simply because it's expensive. It's one thing to spend $20 or $30 on a knife making video because at the end of the day you have a fully functional knife that you can sell or use or whatever. At the end of edge retention testing videos, you have a pile of trash. You're literally just cutting up money. I'm sure somebody's going to find a problem with my method, but I think my methods, especially during this test, were as accurate as anybody else's. They're as consistent as anybody else's. So if you want to compare that to another test, you can compare it. You certainly can't compare the number of cuts made in the particular rope because that particular rope may be a little bit more abrasive than my particular rope. So I will leave you with that info, and you can form your own opinion as to whether or not it's worth spending the extra money for S30v in particular just for the edge retention. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.